It's a pleasure to see everyone here tonight at the second session of the Covenant and Mount Sinai as a model for conversion in rabbinic thought with Rabbi Dan Margulies. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. What is going on in the cryptic covenant ceremony in Exodus chapter 24? How did the rabbis actively model the halakhic structure of formal conversion to Judaism off the covenant Mount Sinai? How did they ensure it would be able to continue even after the destruction of the temple and the loss of sacrifices? What does any of this have to do with the arcane laws of the red heifer? We will explore these questions and more across 3 text-intensive sessions. It's been a pleasure to have Rabbi Margulies teaching here, as this is not his first time at Risha, and we're always glad to have him back. When he's not teaching here, he is a teacher of Tanakh, Talmud, and Halacha at the Berman Hebrew Academy in Rockville. He's also teaching at our summer kollel. I will post sources in chat shortly once things get underway. And if you have questions, you're welcome to ask them to speak out. You're also welcome to ask them in chat. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. And it's wonderful to be back. As I put on the top of the source sheet for those who took a look at it, or Kayla's going to send it around in just a second, recapping last week's class for either for those who need a refresher or if anyone missed or forgot. We looked at Shemot Perek Kaf Dalet, Exodus chapter 24, where we explored a moment in time at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Exactly the chronology is a bit of a debate, but we looked at the Moshe sending the young people to offer a sacrifice, or 2 different types of sacrifices if we read closely: olot, burnt offering sacrifices, and shalamim, peace or free will or goodwill offerings, however they like to be translated. And at that moment, Moshe collects the blood in 2 portions. It says vayasem ba'aganot. He put it into basins or baskets and stores up the blood for some future use. And it seems that certainly at least half the blood should go on the altar as part of the sacrificial process. And then the other half of the blood, there was a debate between whether it also goes on the altar as part of the sacrificial process as well. That's the approach of Unclos and Rabbi Eliezer. And of Rabbi Akiva. And alternatively, Rashi, drawing on an earlier source from the Midrash of Rabbi Eliezer, suggests that the blood was actually splashed or sprinkled onto the people as a very embodied physical symbol of entering into the covenant at Mount Sinai, that is, receiving the Torah and agreeing to the terms of accepting the Torah. And last week, I think I mentioned a book chapter by Professor John Levinson about some of the features of the ancient covenant ceremony and how one of the key features of what it really means to enter into this binding agreement that's hierarchical. There's a top king and there's a subservient partner, but that the role of cutting something in half that symbolizes the dual nature, the bilateral nature, the reciprocal nature of the covenantal relationship, and very often sharing a sacrificial or sacred meal, in this case, eating the sacrifice. We noted last week that the olah, the burnt offering, is consumed by fire on the altar. So in a sense, obviously, God is incorporeal, God does not eat, but in terms of the symbolism of sacrifice, the korban olah is as if providing food to God's table, so to speak. Right? The korbanot are called at korbani lachmi leishai, my sacrifices, which will be as bread on my table or food at my table, being burnt in the fire. And reciprocal or counterbalancing the korban olah, which is as if eaten by God, is the korban shalamim. The korban shalamim is eaten by its owners, generally. And so that's the other half. So if we're talking about a sacred meal where both parties consume of the sacrificial meat and both parties participate in the blood ritual of entering into the covenant, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here with Rashi's perspective. And like I set it up last week, it is a bit of a debate because of the questions that hinge on how to translate the word preposition al in that pasuk. It says that the blood was put Vayizrok al ha'am. Moshe sprinkled or threw the blood on the people. So literally or hyper literally, we would take that to mean literally, like Rashi says, sprinkling the blood on the people. Alternatively, of course, al can mean on behalf of or for. Certainly many places where that can take effect in that way as well. And that was sort of the two different models I suggested last week. Now, this week, we're going to pivot from the Chumash text and looking at the interpreters of the Chumash to our Gemara Masachet Keritot. So those who want to follow along with the old-fashioned Gemara, those who want to follow along online or with the Google Doc or everything with translation I provided, you can pull up on Sefaria if you like, whatever it is. And we're looking first at the first Mishnah in the second chapter of Masachet Keritot. Now, this is not a particularly often studied Masachet, and it certainly contains a lot of challenging material. But if you follow along with the sheet, I think I have some guiding points and some of those footnotes and things and translation there as well. And obviously, if anyone has questions, clarifying questions or concerns as they come up, please feel free to ask. Either do the raise hand button or something along those lines so that I can see and we can all follow along together. I hope the share screen works well for people to be able to see this text, because with Gemara, I do want to make sure that people are able to follow along. You know, obviously we have a range of levels among the people who are participating, and just make sure that everybody can ask their questions as they come up. So the Mishnah in Masachet Keritot says as follows: Arba'a mechasuri kippurim or arba'a mechasuri kapara. There are 4 different classes of people or statuses which are considered to be what the halakha calls mechusar kapara, lacking atonement, which footnote number 1 explains. But basically, this is the idea that after different forms of tum'ah, after different forms of embodied impurity, there are often several steps involved in attaining a full status of fully purified. So even if a person reduces the level of impurity that they've contracted from whatever personal status or contamination or coming in contact with something or a bodily condition or a health condition or something along these lines, nonetheless, there could be several steps involved to coming back to a full level of purity. And the first step is going to be immersion in the mikvah. And the rabbis at least understand from several psukim in the Torah, and there's a whole discussion about whether this is a rabbinic status or a Torah level status, not our topic for tonight. But once a person who was in this impure status immerses in the mikvah, they've definitely knocked their impurity down a level. And they're now what's known as tivul yom. They have immersed that day, but they have to wait until sunset or nightfall, really, for the next stage of their purification to kick in. And that was mentioned in Parashat Shemini, for those who paid attention a few weeks ago in the synagogue reading. So, Arba'a mechusar kippurim. So, mechusar kippurim or mechusar kapara is the next level of severity. That is, if the initial status of impurity is very severe, that is, not only do you need to immerse in the mikveh, and not only do you need to wait until nightfall after the day of immersing in the mikveh, but you need a third thing in a wonderful mazal. Good. You need to wait until you then bring a special sacrifice to complete the purification process, and bringing that particular sacrifice, which is called in this case the kapara, the atonement sacrifice or cleansing sacrifice that you have to bring. Until that point, you're prohibited to eat any sacrificial offering. So you can't contaminate anything else with your impurity, but you're considered by the law to be impure enough to be restricted from eating sacrificial meat until you bring a special sacrifice first. And according to this Mishnah, there are 4 people who have that status. And also, Arba Mivin al Hazadon Kishkaga, not our topic for tonight. There are 4 classes of sin that you bring a sin offering for, even if you commit it intentionally. Usually, the sin offering or purification offering, the Korban Chatat, is brought only for unintentional or inadvertent sins. But here's where the Mishnah says as follows. It says, Eluhen Machasure Kapara, or Kippurim. These are those who are considered to have this low-level intermediate status that needs to be addressed by bringing a sacrifice. Hazav v'hazava v'hayoledet v'hamitzora. A male who has a whitish colored discharge, often interpreted nowadays as having to do with some sort of sexually transmitted disease, possibly gonorrhea or something similar, where there's a purulent or pus-like discharge from the genitalia. V'hazava This is the laws related to irregular or off-cycle menstruation. Again, really not our topic for tonight. Veha yoledet, and a woman after childbirth. Veha metzora, and a person, male or female, who has contracted tzara'at. So in all four of these cases, before this person is going to be able to eat from a sacrificial meat in the future, they have to immerse in the mikveh, wait until nightfall, and then starting as early as the next day, but there's no time limit, they have to bring a certain sacrifice. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, just as an aside, is a fascinating character in the Mishnah, in particular because the later rabbis often note about the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. They say, Mishnato shel Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov kav venaki. The teachings of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov are small in volume. They're only measure a kav, which is a small measure of volume, but naki. They're very clean. They're very pristine teachings. So very often Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's teachings are treated as authoritative because he taught very few things, maybe only 100 or so teachings in the Baraitot and the Mishnayot, but he's considered to have maintained a very strict tradition. Lahavdil, in a similar sense, the mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss, a German mathematician, is known, his family crest that he adopted for himself was a tree with deep roots spreading out with small branches, because Gauss did not publish very many proofs or very many academic papers in his lifetime, but he was very careful to make sure that the work he did produce was pristine and finely polished, as opposed to some of his contemporaries. So we can often think about what's better, to be a very prolific writer or prolific researcher who produces too much work because not all of it is high quality, or is it better to keep your work short and focus on making sure that it's perfect? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, ger mechusar kippurim. A convert is considered to be of this status as well, mechusar kippurim, which means that a ger, a person who converts to Judaism, male or female in this case, upon converting to Judaism, is prohibited to eat from a sacrificial meat until they bring a sacrifice. So this is introducing us to the concept, which we'll see in the Talmud, which is that one of the requisite steps in the conversion process is bringing a sacrifice. And then we'll have to address the question, well, what is it? Wait a second. We know that nowadays, of course, we continue to accept converts into the Jewish community. And the question becomes, how could the rabbis, on the one hand, develop a concept that sacrifice is an important component of what it means to convert to Judaism, and at the same time that we can continue to accept converts even after there is no temple or no ability to bring those sacrifices. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, ger mechusar kippurim ad shizarek alav hadam. And now again, I get to point out the subtleties of the language. I took the translation of this Mishnah here from whatever it is, the Koren's edition, or however it is available online. But notice, what does it say in the Mishnah? Ad sheyizarek alav hadam, until the blood is thrown on him. But then again, the same alav, on him, is the same al that we saw last week. It doesn't mean literally on him in the bold, or as you see, the English editors have interpolated an explanatory translation, which distinguishes between the literal meaning of the word on his and on his behalf, right? Exactly the same question we saw last week. What does this mean? Does this mean that the blood of the sacrifice for the convert has to go on the convert? Or does it mean that the blood of the sacrifice has to go on the altar on behalf or for the convert? Okay, so far so good. So that's our mission. Any questions so far about the status of mechusar kippurim, about zav, zava, yoledet, and metzora, about a ger? And we'll have to see now, what are the psukim, what are the verses in the Torah that the rabbis draw upon in order to explore, well, where in the Torah do we even have a precedent for the concept of a legal mechanism of conversion, the way we think of it nowadays? That is a formal shift in status, right? A person initially has a non-Jewish status, and of course we know non-Jews are not bound to follow the mitzvot of the Torah. Non-Jews are not included in any of the Jewish rituals in the same way that a Jew is. But we acknowledge the fact that it is, of course, possible to, just like many nations, most nations have a process of naturalizing citizens. You can join in and become a citizen of the nation by whatever terms the nation has decided in its constitution and its laws, whatever. So similarly, for a convert to Judaism, a ger, there is some process here. Well, what did the rabbis pick up on in the Torah? Because if you pay attention when you're reading the Torah, you'll see the word ger appears many times. Much of the time, it refers not to what we usually think of now, what the rabbis call a ger tzedek, a convert to Judaism, but rather what we call ger toshav, a resident alien. That's a non-Jew who has a protected legal status to live in the land of Israel under a Jewish government in the Torah times, or according to the halakhic system, which is itself a fascinating and important category. But really, like, again, you read the book of Ezra, you read the book of Ruth, you read the book of, book of Judges. Samson has his whole tryst with this Philistine woman whom he marries, with the riddles, and then his whole business with Delilah, like, they were converting when they married him? Like, I don't think so, right? It doesn't really say. So we get into some of these questions. So the rabbis obviously are trying to construct a system which, and I'm lucky it's Drisha because I get to be honest here, about this kind of thing, which is, I think, again, I'm perfectly comfortable saying the rabbis are empowered to develop these ideas over time. That is, the Torah may not spell out the details exactly, but they're drawing upon psukim in the Torah, precedent in the verses of the Torah to develop these ideas. So let's take a look, okay? So we're in the Gemara in Masachet Keritot. If you're following along on the doc, or if you're following along on the Daf Gemara, it starts on Chet Amud Bet, and then we'll go on to Tet Amud Aleph as well. 8b going into 9a. So first is a Baraita, a source from the same time period as the Mishnah being quoted in the Gemara. Tinu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, excuse me, Ger meukav le'echol b'karashim ad she'yavi kino. A convert may not eat from sacrificial meats until he brings his kan, his nest, which is the way the rabbis refer to a pair of birds. Two birds as a bird sacrifice usually come together, and there's a whole Masachet Kinim about nests, that is pairs of birds. There's a lot of complicated math and probability that gets involved there, which is why we're not studying it tonight, but okay. Hevi perida achat shachrit, and what if he brought a single bird in the morning? Ochel b'karashim la'erev. Then in the afternoon, in the evening, he can eat the sacrificial meat. That is, after bringing even a single bird, post facto, that's okay. Ideally, he would bring both birds, or she. Kol hakinin sheba Torah, every example of a bird sacrifice, which is in the Torah, echad chatat ve'echad olah. One of them is brought as a sin or purification offering, and the other is brought as a burnt offering, korban olah. Kan, but here, in the case of a convert, a case of ger, shtehen olot, both of them, two birds, are both brought as a korban olah, a burnt offering. So I'll pause here for a second. I would love to hear if there are people who have ideas. What might be the difference between every other example in the Torah? There is a korban olah and a korban chatat that come together as a pair, two birds, either two doves or two pigeons, brought together, and one is designated as a korban chatat that the priest will eat, and one is designated as korban olah that the entire bird will be burnt on the altar. But in the case of a ger, in the case of a convert, when a person converts to Judaism, the first sacrifice they're supposed to bring is going to be a pair of birds, but both birds are korban olah. They're both a burnt offering offered purely on the altar. The priest gets nothing. What's going on there?
I mean,
Martha.
One suggestion is that it's considered that when someone converts, their prior life is dead.
Okay.
So it's like a sort of a spiritual interpretation of the transformation of their identity.
So you're saying what? That the bird that is offered and burnt up on the altar is like their past life that they're giving up and severing ties to their past. Okay.
Yes.
A bit drastic. There is a lot of discussion. No, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the halakhic literature. On the one hand, it can be very empowering for some people as converts to feel that they have started a new life and starting afresh. But for other people, I don't think it's necessarily psychologically healthy for them to think that they're literally severing ties with their whole past life. So it can be complicated. Okay. Yes. What else? Any other ideas? Again, I know it's hard for us as modern people to try to put our heads into the symbolism of the sacrifices. Okay. Oh, interesting. So Leah put a suggestion here. She says a variant of that idea is the ger was not before conversion obligated to observe the mitzvot, so there's no sin that they have to atone for. So it can be purely a korban olah, a burnt offering, a gift to God of gratitude, of celebration, but no need for purification or atonement for sin. Okay, another nice idea like that a lot. I'll emphasize one thing that's unique here, which is that every other sacrifice, including a mammalian korban olah, something goes to the priest. If you bring a korban mincha, a scoop of flour, the Kohen takes a handful and gets to keep a handful of the flour for the altar, and the rest of the flour the Kohanim get to make into pancakes, biscuits, cookies, certain kind of things. When you bring a korban chatat, most of it gets eaten by the priest also. When you bring a korban shlamim, you get to eat most of it. Part of it the priest gets to eat, and part of it goes on the altar. When you bring a mammalian, a mammal, a cow, goat, or sheep as a korban chatat, as a korban olah, burnt offering, all of the meat is going to go on the altar. But what about the hide? What about the animal's skin? The hide of the animal goes to the Kohen who does the work as payment for the hard effort of, schlepping all the pieces of meat up onto the grill. So the olat ha'of, a bird burnt offering, is actually very unique. It is the only sacrifice that goes purely in 100% entirely to God. Even the korban olah, when it's in a mammal, that is, it's this great gift you're giving to God, still some of it goes to the Kohen. So maybe part of the symbolism of this is that the relationship a ger has in their first sacrifice is converting to God, converting to Judaism, is I'm making a gift which is purely dedicated to God, nothing to the Kohen. Direct, unmediated access. Right? So that's another possibility. Let's continue on in the Gemara. Any other thoughts about this, or we'll continue?
Well, one question, does that mean, anytime they make an offering?
No, just the first time. This is
Just the very first time. Yeah, okay.
The first offering that they bring after they've converted. And now we're going to get into the Gemara. We'll explore where is this derived from. So the Gemara quotes from a pasuk from Bimidbar, Perek Tetvav, Tichtiv, as it says, Ka'asher ta'asu kain ya'aseh. The same way that you do it, that is a natural-born Jew, so shall he do it, that is a person who converts. Ma'atem olah ushlamim, just like you brought a burnt offering and a peace offering, af ger olah ushlamim. A ger also should bring a burnt offering and a peace offering. Now, this is very cryptic, because this Gemara is assuming you're familiar with the stuff that we learned last week. So take a look at footnote number 2 at the bottom, and we can see. Okay, footnote number 2 at the bottom, quoting the pasuk that we studied last week from Shemot, Perek, Kaf Dalet, Vayishlach et na'arei b'nei Yisrael. He, Moshe, sent the youths of Israel, Vaya'alu olot, vayizbechu zevachim shilamim la'adonai parim, and they offered up as burnt offerings and peace offerings, bulls to Hashem, to God. So that's the verse that it seems they're alluding to. That is just like Bnei Yisrael at the foot of Mount Sinai, at the moment of receiving the Torah, offered burnt offerings, olot, and peace offerings, shalamim. The burnt offerings are to God, and the shalamim are for them to eat and enjoy themselves. The rabbis here are interpreting the phrase from Bamidbar, Ka'asher ta'asu kain ya'aseh, the same way that you do it, he, the ger, should do it as well, means that just like Bnei Israel at Mount Sinai offered these two types of sacrifices, so too a ger should offer these two types of sacrifices as well, the korban olah and korban shilamim. Okay, so already now we've drawn this connection between the moment of sealing the brit, sealing the covenant at Mount Sinai, at the moment of revelation, with the process of initiating a convert into the Jewish people. Okay. And that's something interesting to think about, because, of course, a new convert is someone who is accepting upon themselves the Torah, membership in the Jewish people, the weight of Jewish history and the responsibility of what that means to really join in with the rest of the nation. And when did the whole nation do that? When did Bnei Israel join in with their sense of nationhood, their sense of fidelity to the Torah, their commitment to God? was at Mount Sinai, was at the revelation of the Torah. Okay, so that seems to be what the rabbis are picking up on thematically, that serves as this hook for them, this idea of ka'asher ta'asu kein yaseh. So the Gemara continues a little bit, and we'll go into the next part, which is just on the next Amud of the Gemara on 9a, on Ted Amud Aleph. And the Gemara quotes another Baraita, Tanya Idach. There's another source which says something similar. Ve'asa ishe reach nichoach la'Adonai. When you bring an offering, a fire offering, to provide a smell for God, shome'ani kol she'oleh li'ishim. You might have thought that the process to convert to Judaism can involve any type of sacrifice, anything that gets burnt on the altar. Kol she'oleh li'ishim, everything that gets burnt. Afilu mincha, even a meal offering, something made of flour. Just like you did it back then, so too he has to do it now. Ma'atem minei damim, afhem minei damim. Just like you, Bnei Israel, needed to bring a sacrifice which involves the shedding of blood, animal blood, so too a convert must be initiated with bringing a sacrifice that involves animal blood as well. Okay, and there's something very evocative, I think, about this phrase, minei damim, types of blood, right? So again, is it explicit in the Gemara exactly what's happening here? Not so much. We're trying to tease out some of these details, but now they're telling me that because of the emphasis of this phrase, ka'asher ta'asu kein ya'aseh, that the process of conversion has to parallel the moment that Bnei Israel stood at Mount Sinai, and we know that that involved an animal sacrifice, as described in Exodus chapter 24. So the potential convert is entering into the covenantal membership in the Jewish people also through a sacrifice. It must be an animal sacrifice, not any sacrifice. So the Gemara asks, so wouldn't you say that that means burnt offering and a peace offering as well? Just like you, the convert should be. But the Gemara says, but that means lachem hikashtiv velo ledavar acher lekorbanotechem, that a convert is equated with a born Jew. What does it mean that they're equivalent? Kachem kager yihye. A convert will be like you, like a born Jew. That is, they have equivalent status. Okay, they're basically almost, let's call it 99.5% of ways or something like that. Basically everything, a convert is equivalent to a born Jew. And that's what this pasuk means. But don't think, says the Talmud, that that means that the sacrifices have to be identical, that they need to bring both a korban olah and a korban shlamim. It's the korban olah that the ger has to bring, that the convert has to bring, but not the korban shlamim. Korban shlamim is not essential to the process of conversion. So understand what the rabbis have done. They said, here's the verse in Exodus 24 that serves as the basis for our understanding of conversion. This is the moment of standing at Har Sinai and entering the covenant. That's what we're drawing upon. That's our model for conversion. But we're not going to take every single thing from it. We're going to take one detail, the korban olah, and leave the other detail, the korban shlamim, to the side. Lachem hikashtiv, I've connected him to you. That is, the status of a ger and the status of Bnei Israel who stood at Har Sinai are equivalent. V'lo ledavar acher, we're not equivalent in what type of sacrifices we brought. Lo lekorbanotechem, they don't bring equivalent sacrifices. The convert has to bring a korban olah, but there's no requirement that the convert brings a korban shlamim. That's the way that Gemara has interpreted, on the one hand, the verse from Numbers 15 and the verse from Exodus 24. The Gemara continues quoting a Baraita, this time now quotes the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who interprets it slightly differently. Rabbi Omer, kachem ka'avotechem. Like you, how is a convert supposed to be like you? Excuse me. Ka'avotechem, like your ancestors. Ma avotechem lo nichnesu labrit ela b'mila u'tfilah behartzat dam. Just like your ancestors entered into the covenant, presumably this means entering into the covenant at Mount Sinai when they received the Torah, with milah, circumcision for men, tvilah, immersion in the mikvah, behartzat dam, the phrase that last week I translated as a presentation of blood. If you look at footnote number 3, right, that is the phrase hartza'at dam may be translated presentation of sacrificial blood. It usually refers to the blood being applied to the altar. I made a typo. I'm sorry. It should be altar with an A. Okay. And Mount Sinai saw the blood sprinkling on the people as ritzui, or whether it was on the altar. So here, what is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi saying? Kachem ka'avotechem. Ma avotechem lo nichnesu labrit ela b'mila u'tfila v'hartza'at dam. Just like your ancestors at Mount Sinai entered into the covenant with 3 ingredients: circumcision, immersion in the mikvah, and whatever hartza'at dam means, from the shoresh resh tzadi he, to be ratzon, to be nirtzah, to be acceptable, to be presented before someone to accept it willingly. Afheim lo yikansu labrit ela b'mila u'tfila v'hartza'at damim. So too, when a person converts to Judaism, there are 3 ingredients. If the person is a man, he needs to be circumcised, and for men and women, they need immersion in the mikvah and the offering of a sacrifice. That's usually how this is understood. Hartza'at dam, meaning what? Meaning that the blood of the sacrifice must be presented on the altar. Now, someone who was paying attention, problematize it for me. What is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi potentially saying about this hartza'at dam? Think back to last week a little bit. Think back to the question of what it really means to enter into a covenantal relationship. What does it mean? Ad sheyizarek alav et hadam, that the blood will be thrown or sprinkled on him or on his behalf. Connect the dots, yeah? No? Nobody wants to volunteer. That's okay.
I mean, maybe, okay, I'll start things off with a curveball. Until the blood is on the dash, he is not yet, Argera is not converted. So the priest has to do it for him. And once that blood touches it, he is. Is that a possible grand pull through?
You're saying the blood has to get on the mizbeach, onto the altar, in order to
that
affect
is
the conversion status. So
yeah,
that certainly is
to jump to the future, I would call that the okay, you've dipped in the mikvah. This is a model that will probably be relevant in a future class.
So that is, what is the moment that the person switches from non-Jewish to Jewish?
Well,
possibly, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi lists 3 ingredients: circumcision, immersion in the mikvah, and the sacrifice. So it's possible to interpret that as saying that the sacrifice itself is a necessary step to effect the change of status of conversion. That's certainly one possible read. The halakha does not end up going in that direction.
And I'd argue, say, if you're looking at kiddushin or marriage, that's like a multi-step thing where, you have until you do X, Y, and Z, you haven't changed from this stage where you are not Makadesher to a stage where you are Makadesher.
So this is certainly one possibility.
The order is a bit unclear. Is that what you're saying?
So that comes up in the Gemara Masachet Yevamot. There's a question about how many steps are necessary. So there's a little bit of a debate among the Tanaim about what if someone was circumcised but not immersed in the mikvah, or vice versa. What if someone immersed in the mikvah is not circumcised? Does the conversion take effect? And what are there other necessary steps in the process of conversion? We haven't seen it mentioned here in this Gemara, but potentially the whole question of exactly to what extent formal acceptance of the mitzvot is a process necessary to the process of conversion. Is that by definition the process of conversion? And these are all, the sequence that takes place after that. Is that something that was imposed later onto an earlier structure in the Talmud? Again, that's a different Gemara. I would suggest here, based off the framework I've been building up until now, that one possibility for interpreting this focus on the bringing of the sacrifice and the phrase hartza'at damim, or potentially could be a corrupted form of a different phrasing, perhaps haza'at damim, sprinkling of blood, is actually that the conversion process has to parallel the moment at Mount Sinai. So just like there is such an opinion, like Rashi and Rabbi Eliezer understood that the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled half on the altar and half on the people, that the blood is a marker of entering into the covenant. So too, it's possible to understand that this is at least drawing upon some of that symbolism to say that either the bringing of a sacrifice, or even more radically, the sprinkling of sacrificial blood on the convert is part of the conversion process. Now, that definitely is not going to get accepted as the halacha in the final stratum of the sugya. By the time, certainly after the temple is destroyed, and the Amoraim, the Talmudic rabbis are debating this, they've basically peeled away that possibility entirely. But I think there is at least a vestigial reference to some of that much more embodied, much more, in their time, even it was ancient. It was over 1,000 years old at that point already. This kind of symbolism, which really is evocative of the ancient Near Eastern concept of brit, of covenant between the king and the vassal. So if each individual Jew who stood at Mount Sinai, whether physically or metaphorically, is party to the brit, is party to the covenant with God given in the Torah through by dint of their accepting the Torah, of being part of the Jewish nation. If it's a convert who's actively choosing to join, well, that means that they're paralleling what happened in Jewish history at that moment. Well, part of that process seems to focus significantly on the role that this Korban Olah played, and the blood of the sacrifice being a very powerful symbol. Moshe says, Zeh dam habrit, this is the covenantal blood. And we have many psukim in Tanakh, in the Torah, that emphasize blood as a very potent symbol of course, the blood of an animal is the animal's life force, right? We treat it with seriousness and appropriate distance. We don't eat the blood, we pour the blood on the ground. In part, that's because actually the life force of the animal is not something that's given over to human beings to consume. That's something that belongs to God, so to speak. Blood, when it's used in sacrificial form, is to atone for our sins on the altar. That is, we are using an animal in place of our own, shedding our own blood, so to speak, or the symbolism that it's supposed to evoke, risking your own life, endangering your own life. We talk about people swearing a blood oath or sealing a covenant with blood. These are the same kinds of things where, again, blood is a very potent symbol of life and death and injury and vitality is really an important sacred thing. And so if you're going to do something as serious as entering into a covenant of receiving the Torah into your life and being a member of this nation, well, it's going to have to involve spilling of blood. Again, this is very not modern notion of any of this, but I think it can be thought-provoking, I hope. So far, so good. I'm going to continue in the Gemara because there's more here. We'll get a little further. Okay, so for following along in the Gemara at home, we just read the passage from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi about the 3 ingredients. Like I said, the practical halacha, when it comes down to it, ends up saying that there are 2 necessary steps to effect the conversion, that the conversion actually takes place after the immersion in the mikveh, and the obligation to bring a sacrifice is something that kicks in after the conversion has taken effect. But the way Rebbe presents it in this baraita is really that there are 3 steps. So it sounds a little bit like the timeline is off. So the Gemara continues. Amar Mar, the previous baraita had stated, I really don't like when they say the master said, by the way, just as a Gemara teacher. Amar Mar means that the Gemara is reopening a conversation about a source that was quoted earlier. So if you just translate it as the master stated, it doesn't capture what it's doing functionally as a term in the sugya. The phrase Amar Mar means, as we stated previously, now we're going to do a deep dive into something that was originally a tangent, and now we're going to focus on it. Okay? It's like, as I mentioned previously on last week's episode, right? That's what Amar Mar is. Okay? So I yell at my students when they translate it as the master said. Okay, Amar Mar. So this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, that it requires 3 steps to enter into the covenant. So the Gemara says, Bishlama Mila, I will say, granted, that makes perfect sense that you say you need circumcision to enter into the brit. Tichtiv ki mulim hayu kol ha'am hayotziim. Because we have a verse in the book of Joshua that tells us that all of the men who left Egypt were circumcised, and therefore to enter into the covenant of being the Jewish nation and receiving the Torah is predicated upon the men being circumcised. We of course know when God initially commands the mitzvah of Brit Milah to Abraham in Genesis, Of course, Abraham immediately circumcises the men of his household and promises to uphold this covenant for all future males in his family line going forward. It is a little bit unusual that they're quoting a pasuk from Joshua, rather than from the Torah. Interesting. Do we have any real reference in the Torah that the men were circumcised? If anyone remembers the end of Parashat Bo, that's like Exodus chapter 14, beginning of chapter 14. There's discussion, or end of chapter 13, there's discussion there about it's prohibited to eat from the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, for a man who's uncircumcised. The implication being that if all of the men who left Egypt ate from the Passover sacrifice in order to be protected from the 10th plague before leaving Egypt, it must be that all of the men were circumcised in order to be able to have been saved from the plague and then to be able to escape slavery in Egypt. So that's another implication. It would have been harder to spell out just by quoting a pasuk, but I think that's a better argument. But anyway, Inami Mahacha alternatively quotes the pasuk that it's in some of the Haggadot. It's a little bit of a graphic pasuk. It's from a very complicated section of the book of Yechezkel. I passed over you and saw you wallowing in your blood. And I told you, by your blood shall you live. Okay. Which Chazal repeatedly take as reference to the blood of circumcision and the blood of menstruation and the blood of the Korban Pesach, that these are all markers of Jewish identity and upholding certain of the mitzvot in the Torah. So the Gemara says, granted, I'll buy it that in order to become a Jew, you need circumcision, because we have a lot of references to how important circumcision is as a marker of Jewish identity. And Hartza'at Damim, what about the presentation of blood, the acceptability of your sacrificial blood? Tichtiv vayishlach na'arei b'nei Israel quotes that same pasuk, Exodus chapter 24, that we're interested in, the moment when Moshe has the young people of Bnei Israel offer these sacrifices. And that, he says, okay, granted, I'll buy it. Perfect reference there. So right now we've established at Har Sinai, the men were all circumcised. There were sacrifices offered on behalf of the people. Moshe did that thing with the blood. Ela tvila min alan. What is the textual evidence that anyone immersed in a mikvah at Har Sinai? That there was a mikvah at Har Sinai? Anyone remembers? There's a reference to a stream flowing down from the mountain, but it doesn't say anybody went bathing in it. It says Moshe made them drink some of the water once he ground up the golden calf. So the Gemara makes a very strange argument now, and this is going to be the hook for what we're going to explore next week. Ela tvila min Allah. What is the evidence that in order to enter into the covenant at Mount Sinai, people had to immerse in the mikveh? And remember, especially important is the fact that for men, circumcision may be the primary concern for conversion. But of course, for women who are not circumcised, there has to be an equivalent process, embodied process, whereby you emerge a Jew. And the rabbis are obviously interested in immersion in the mikveh as part of that process, but they have less textual evidence maybe to base it on. So see what they do here. Dichtiv, they quote the pasuk from the same pasukim that we're interested in. Vayikach Moshe chatzi hadam. Moshe took half of the blood, vayizrok al ha'am, and he threw it on the people. What does that have to do with the mikveh? Moshe sprinkled them with blood, even if that's what it means, that he sprinkled the people with the blood, or it means he sprinkled the blood on the altar. What does it have to do with immersion in the mikveh? The Gemara says, ve'ein haza'ah below tvila. There could be no sprinkling without prior immersion in the mikveh. The implication being, since Moshe did this thing with the sprinkling the blood, whatever it is, whether it was sprinkling the blood on the altar, whether it was sprinkling the blood on the people, it must have, since we know halakha, since we know this concept, it must have been preceded by immersion in the mikveh. So the immersion in the mikveh on the one hand here is crucial. That's like a core tenet of what it means to convert to Judaism. This is how modern understanding of halakha recognizes particularly a woman's entry into Judaism, because that's the process that a woman does, physical process to demonstrate that she's joining the Jewish people. And yet it's not even derived from an explicit verse in the Torah. It's derived from an implication from a verse in the Torah about something else, about the sacrifice. which hinges on this rabbinic assumption, which we haven't seen justified here. We'll look at it more next week. Ein haza'a below tefillah. There can be no sprinkling without prior immersion. Questions so far, or objections?
Where did that, wait, that's not, is that, they haven't mentioned this yet, right? This is the
Correct.
first.
They have
we're
not
hearing
mentioned
about
this yet.
an immersion
First-
before sprinkling, okay.
Correct. First, we're hearing of it. We'll
Oh.
look into it more, but it's the first we're hearing of it.
Wow.
So the whole concept of immersion in the mikvah is a key ingredient in conversion for men and especially for women, is derived from a logical implication of a pasuk that is predicated on particular rabbinic assumptions about how to read the pasuk and what halakhic framework that pasuk fits into. So it's really a lot of begging the question. Okay? With me. And again, what does lehazot mean? Haza'ah. Haza'ah means sprinkling. Okay? What does hartza'ah mean? It's not the same word. Hartza'ah means presenting, making acceptable. We said the implication of the word hartza'ah primarily is offering the sacrificial blood on the altar. What does haza'ah mean? Lehazot is to sprinkle. Usually the priest does that with the finger dipped in the blood and sprinkles it in the direction of something, like when the priest sprinkles the blood on the curtain or between the poles of the ark on Yom Kippur. Anything else gets sprinkled in Judaism? Maybe not blood. Other liquids, other fluids?
The water with the hyssop and the
Yes,
paraduma.
Miriam. Very good. So as I hinted to in the course description, and this is again something that the Tosafot are going to pick up on. There's something here where this is the same word that's used for the sprinkling of the purifying water of the paraduma, the water that when a person contracts an impurity related to a dead body or corpse or death, the way to purify from that is not only immersion in the mikvah, but actually sprinkling with this special water that's prepared with the ashes of the burnt red heifer. And that seems to be at least one of the contexts where this phrase, ein haza'ah below tefillah, appears. There can be no sprinkling of the water of paraduma without first having immersed in the mikvah. But there are two people involved here, right? There's the Kohen who does the sprinkling, and there's the person who's impure who's getting sprinkled upon, okay? So that's also part of it. Who has to go to the mikvah, the Kohen or the person getting sprinkled on? But it says, ein haza'ah below tefillah. There's no sprinkling without immersion prior. Here's another problem. When I mentioned just a minute ago, when the Kohen dips his finger into the bowl of sacrificial blood to sprinkle it for certain of the sacrifices, well, there too, ein haza'ah below tvila. You're not allowed to sprinkle the blood before tovel means what? Ein anu matbilin afilu pamachat. What does tovel mean?
Dip or immerse.
To dip or immerse. So in this case, if the Kohen has to sprinkle the blood, what does he have to do first? The finger has to dip into the bowl. If he has to sprinkle the blood 7 times, each time, he doesn't get to do 2 sprinkles from one dip of the finger. You got to dip the finger and then sprinkle. Dip of the finger and then sprinkle. Ein haza'ah below tvila. So there are many different concepts which are encoded in these 4 words. We have something to do with the purification process of paraduma. We have something to do about the proper process of sprinkling the sacrificial blood of the most holy atonement purification offerings. And we have something to do with conversion. The plot thickens. Okay? So far, so good?
Can I ask a question? This all feels like hugely complicated and maybe even unnecessarily complicated. Because, and I'm so sorry, I missed last week, and it's totally possible that you taled about this, and if so, I apologize. But I mean, it just says right there, if you're going to base it on Har Sinai, and they did say that you have to wash your clothes, which usually is
Okay, good.
followed by immersion. Is that not like, isn't that so much more simple than and the finger was immersed, and so therefore the woman is immersed? And I doesn't that seem like it's more straightforward?
Miriam knows her Chumash very well, and Miriam asks a wonderful question, which is, I agree with Miriam's point 100%, which is, if all you were looking for was evidence that before receiving the Torah, you had to purify yourself with washing in water, it says in the Torah, "V'chibesu simlotam," as part of the 3 days of preparation to receive the Torah, go wash your clothes. And we know, good rabbinic Jews that we are, since we've learned Midrash Halacha a little bit, right? Every time it says to wash your clothes, it doesn't just mean wash your clothes. You, the person, also have to immerse in the mikveh, because washing the clothes is that the clothes might contaminate you. So you have to purify and your clothes have to purify. So Miriam's question is exactly right, which is they have a perfectly healthy, good pasuk to tell me that you have to immerse in the mikveh before receiving the Torah at Har Sinai, if that's all we were talking about. And therefore, Miriam, what must be the implication?
There's always so much more.
There's something else going on here besides just that. They don't only care about the immersion in the mikveh as immersion in the mikveh. It's something else going on here. And like I said, I think there's like some kind of vestigial idea here, which we're unpacking, and it is not what ends up being decided as the practical halacha by the later strata of halakhic decisors. So we're doing a little bit halakhic archaeology here, which is like we're peeling away some strange coded references to something weird and arcane, and perhaps even it was arcane in the time of Chazal, 1800 years ago, and for them it was 1200 years old, trying to or more to unpack what was going on in the Torah. And there's definitely something unusual. So I agree 100%. And Miriam, thanks for asking that question, because it opens up exactly that point. So let's just finish off the last little bit of this Gemara here, which is as follows. Elama'ata ha'idna deleka korban lo nekabel gerim. The Gemara asks the question I hinted to before, which is, are you going to tell me that now, since the 3 ingredients you insisted on for conversion are circumcision, immersion in the mikveh, and offering a sacrifice, that we can no longer accept converts because we don't have the temple to bring sacrifices? Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, one of the Amoraim, now even later than the earlier Tanaim discussing this, says, no. It must be that we can continue to accept converts. Why? Because the pasuk says in Numbers chapter 15, B'midbar Tedvav, when a convert lives among you, and the continuation of the pasuk is not quoted in our Talmudic text, but they assume you know the whole pasuk, but it's there in the English, ledorotechem, for all generations. So what is his implication of how to read that verse? Or for all generations, that is, in each generation, it must be possible to accept converts. Accepting converts is something that cannot be defined out of existence in the halacha. The Torah mandates that accepting converts is something that continues ledorotechem, for all generations. And therefore, even after the temple is destroyed, even after sacrifices are impossible, the rabbis say it must be that bringing the sacrifice is not a necessary step in the conversion process. So even though standing at Mount Sinai and participating in that covenant ritual with the blood and the sacrifice and everything is what the rabbis are focusing on textually in the Torah, they have to be able to say that conversion can continue after the destruction of the temple. And so they're sort of stuck, because the model they have for the idea of conversion is standing at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, there were sacrifices, but we have to be able to accommodate converts even after sacrifice is impossible. Tenu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ger bisman hazeh, a person who converts nowadays, and of course the implication of nowadays means nowadays after the temple has been destroyed, tzarich sheyafrish rova lekino. He must set aside a quarter dinar in order to buy a pair of birds when the temple will be rebuilt, so that he can bring the sacrifice. Rabbi Shimon says, Kavar nimna alav Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ubitila. No, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, remember, he was the head of the Sanhedrin in the generation that the temple was destroyed. So Rabbi Shimon reports, no. This was a bad idea. They tried this for a few months, let's say a few years. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, actually having money set aside, dedicated in advance to buy a sacrifice is a big problem, because people are going to mess up with that coin and they're going to end up mixing it in with their regular coins, and then it's going to be a problem. Mipnei hatakala, there's too much risk involved. It's a bad idea. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got rid of that. So at least initially, a convert needs to bring a sacrifice. Then after the temple is destroyed, a convert needs to set aside the money to buy the sacrifice as soon as the temple will be rebuilt. And then, no, it's too risky. Don't set aside the money. We'll back off on the concept of converts bringing a sacrifice. Amar Rav Idi bar Gershom, Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, halacha Rabbi Shimon. So the way the sugya has progressed, we started off the earlier sources, particularly many of the sources from the Tanaim, especially even anonymous Braitot from the time of the Tanaim, focusing a lot on the sacrificial component of becoming a convert. It's all about burning your korban olah, it's connection to God. It's this something unique that you get to do, and the blood is this potent symbol of covenant and your sanctification, and the blood goes on the altar, and you're joining the partnership with God. And they're like, no, back off. We don't want people to have a silver coin that's dedicated to Beit HaMikdash for a sacrifice, and then they're going to end up putting it in the laundromat, and it's going to cause all sorts of problems. So I said, no, it's a bad idea. And that's like a step back from this idea, where whatever work we've done to develop conceptually this idea of sacrifice and blood are super important for understanding conversion. The later later stratum of this sugya says, number one, conversion must be possible even after the temple is destroyed. We quote a pasuk for that, ledorotechem, it must be for all generations. And number two, there's too much risk involved in even trying to keep alive the memory of sacrifice as part of the conversion process. And so now, if you ask a modern conversion beit din, what are the 3 ingredients for conversion? Many people will tell, maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to say the rabbis don't know, but maybe average layman who's at least familiar with the concept of conversion, perhaps a little bit, will say, 3 steps of conversion must be circumcision, immersion in the mikveh, and acceptance of the mitzvot, kabbalat mitzvot. And that's often what conversion handbooks and instruction manuals and things like this will say. The 3 steps are circumcision for men, immersion in the mikveh for men and women, and a verbal declaration and intent, a heartfelt intent that they're accepting upon themselves the mitzvot and that they're joining the Jewish people. In the Gemara, the 3 steps are circumcision, immersion in the mikveh, which is derived from a very strange pasuk, and which really connects to the korban part, and the korban. And the korban seems to be the central component. And then over time seems to have been downplayed in several tiers. Okay? So that's where we're going to stay for now. It's good that Miriam brought up the reference to para aduma, the purification related to the red heifer. So our topic for next week, this week, we just learned through one Gemara, but we have all the ingredients now. Next week, we're going to see a few comments of the Tosafot and maybe some other Talmudic commentaries as well, who in various ways try to revive this dead concept. At first, when I came across this myself in my learning a few years ago, I thought, like, this is something I thought of, that can't be right. And then I was like, oh, but this person also references, this person also references. I was like, oh, so there's like 6 people who figured it out. So then I'm not crazy. Then it's just not well known. You understand the difference? If it were just me, I'd be like, okay, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Once there are a handful of people, I think, like, there's something here, but it's hidden and cryptic and needs further work unpacking. Any questions right now before we close out for tonight? Otherwise, the thrilling conclusion will be next week, where we try to piece all the pieces together.
Then there are places in Navi where God says, you think I'm interested in these expensive sacrifices you're giving? I want a sacrifice of your heart. So is that one of the ways that they sort of justify or not justify, but create some kind of equivalency that third thing is no longer possible, but we have something even more valuable to offer God, meaning?
I would say that's definitely in conversation. I haven't seen it cited explicitly, but certainly you're correct that the theme throughout the prophets, from the earlier prophets like Samuel all the way through Amos and Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, repeatedly, the Nevi'im tell us in many different ways, God wants obedience, God wants justice and kindness and love and care for other human beings much more than sacrifices. So many times in Jewish history, we've seen people who are scrupulous and attendant to detail about their ritual observances and care nothing for the society that they've built and mutual responsibility for your neighbors and the downtrodden and oppressed in society. So of course, the great Nevi'im repeatedly point out the hypocrisy. How can you be someone whose economic policies or whose political policies have been such that they're oppressive and corrupt, and you accept bribes, and you're immoral in all of your interpersonal relationships, but you bought the most beautiful sacrifice to the temple, right? 100%, right? And so the Nevi'im certainly are critical of that stance. And of course, one of the great successes of Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple is being able to make that pivot where we say, yeah, we've had this voice in our tradition the whole time that has downplayed sacrifice. There's definitely something compelling and powerful about the idea of sacrificing something valuable for God, taking something that costs a lot of money and is very physical and embodied and hands-on. And that's not the only way to do it. And so for sure, there's a dialogue going on here between those two extremes. We've been on the other extreme now for 2,000 years. And so there's definitely something that people, what is it that draws so many people to New Age ritual practices or neo-pagan kind of things and Jew witch and this, that, right? There's so many things where it's like, or people in the Hasidic community who are interested in, this lead pouring fortune telling, or people who get so into the challah bakes and all these. I'm not trying to be disparaging about anything in case there are things people really like. The idea is like, yeah, people need hands-on rituals and to feel like they're dedicating something of their time and physical effort and craft and skill to a mitzvah or to something religious, and not just your heart and your mind, because we can do that and it's hard, and there is other stuff to being a human being also. And so we're always trying to navigate that tension for sure. That's like much more big picture, Martha, but you're right. Yeah.
I just have another thing, because I'm trying to learn Nidarim, and it occurred to me when their objection to having people set aside money for when the temples might be that you would be making a netter or silent netter to yourself that you're going to bring, and then there's an obligation to fulfill a netter like within 3 months or whatever it is. So they don't want you like making and have an intention to do something that you cannot fulfill.
Right. And so the practical halakhic upshot of this ends up being the recommendation of the conversion works without the sacrifice. When the temple will be rebuilt, every convert who's alive will have an obligation to bring their sacrifice at that point. But don't set the money aside. Don't declare this coin is designated for my sacrifice, because like it's going to get lost and then you're going to have a problem. It's going to get mixed in with all your other coins, and you're going to have a million of these annoying sugyot about a mixture
and you won't have fulfilled something that you...
Correct. So they're both components, right? There's the concern of losing the coin and the concern of violating your verbal declaration. So good. Look forward to seeing everyone next week. Thank you again so much. Huge help from Kayla. And so huge thank you to Kayla and of course Trisha for running and sponsoring and organizing all these amazing shiurim. Hope everyone is enjoying the learning. And again, if you have any other questions or concerns or things you discover in the sources, bring them up at the beginning next week. Looking forward to the thrilling conclusion. Same bad time, same bad channel. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
See you all next week. And if you want to keep learning with Drisha, we have several Sphere Zman classes starting this week, including tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern, Revelations from the Whirlwind with Rabbi Tzvi Tsineski. Find out more at drisha.org/classes. Take care and good night, everyone.